Hello, everyone. My name is Sydney Yeager, and I am the Public Programs Coordinator at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm so excited to kick off tonight's program, the Jewish Multiverse, Judaism, and Superheroes. Before we begin, I would like to thank the Society of Illustrators for co-presenting tonight's program. Joining us tonight are Marguerite Bennett, Chris Claremont, and Danny Fingeroth, who will be in conversation with Abraham Riesman. Marguerite Bennett is a GLAAD Media Award-nominated New York Times best-selling author. She's written for both Marvel and DC Comics on titles such as DC Bombshells, Batwoman, and A-Force. She also has her own creator-owned books, Insects and Animosity. Chris Claremont is also a New York Times best-selling author who had a 17-year unbroken run writing for Uncanny X-Men. Chris created numerous characters including Legion, the New Mutants, Rogue, Gambit, Sabretooth, Kitty Pryde, and the White Queen. He also has several creator-owned works such as The Black Dragon and Murata, The She-Wolf, and Sovereign 7. Danny Fingeroth is an editor and writer at Marvel Comics who is best known for his work as editor of the Spider-Man line of titles. He has also written for other Marvel comics, including the Fantastic Four and Iron Man. Danny is an author of 4 books and co-author of 1, the titles of which include Superman on the Couch, What Superheroes Really Tell Us About Ourselves and Our Society, and Disguised as Clark Kent, Jews Comics, and the Creation of the Superhero. And Abraham Riesman, who will be serving as our moderator this evening, is a freelance writer and essayist. He's written for New York Magazine, Vulture, The Washington Post, and many others. His book, True Believer, The Rise and Fall of Stan Lee, was published on February 16th, 2021. During the discussion, please feel free to share questions in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can during the hour. This program is being recorded, and the video will be available tomorrow on the museum's YouTube channel. Thank you all again for being here, and I'm now going to hand things over to Abraham.
Am I unmuted? Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Good. Great. Hi, everybody who's watching, and hi to all of our wonderful panelists. This is an honor. I won't talk about myself much, but I am Jewish, and I have spent too much time thinking about superheroes over the course of my years on this earth. And in the wake of Simchat Torah, it feels like a perfect time to talk about Jewish stories, although not necessarily Jewish stories that you might find in a scroll. They're the ones you might find in a comic book. And our panelists tonight have, if you don't know from comics, maybe you're thinking, okay, well, maybe these are interesting people. I can tell you, I know from comics, these are very interesting people. These are folks who have a lot of experience in the world of comics, and I hope that we can sort of talk to them, and they have different backgrounds, I'm sure, when it comes to their Jewishness, and I would love to hear what they have to say. So why don't we start out by just sort of going around the horn. I'd like to ask everybody if you could name your favorite Jewish superhero, just a nice little icebreaker. There's such a wide and yet at the same time limited selection, so I'm curious what people have to say. Who wants to go first? Chris, you go first.
Age before beauty strikes again. I guess I would have to say Kitty.
Yeah. You're not the only one who would say that.
I saw it first.
We'll get Kitty Pryde, for those who don't know, is a Jewish superhero whom Chris was one of the people who created her in the pages of the X-Men. Say again?
Me and John Byrne.
You and John Byrne, exactly. And she is Jewish and has been a lodestar for a lot of people who look for Jewish identification in comics for a long time. We'll get into some more detail about that later. But how about you, Marguerite? Who's your favorite Jewish superhero? I think I know what your answer is going to be, but I still want to ask. Maybe you'll throw us a curveball. Har har har.
Oh no, har har. No, Batwoman, Kate Kane is still my one true love. She debuted when I was 18 years old and closeted in the South in high school, and she meant so much to me, and she still does.
Great. I can't wait to talk more about her in a moment. And then Danny, so many to choose from. Who's your most Jewish superhero, your favorite one?
My favorite, I think, is a very obscure character named Dominic Fortune, who was a swashbuckling adventurer created by Howard Chaykin. whose real name was Davy Fortunoff, and was born and raised on the Lower East Side of New York. And other writers, including me, brought him in. So he exists, in stories set in the 1930s, usually about Nazis hiding in plain sight somewhere in America in the lead up to World War II. And then he was brought into the present day by some J.M. DeMatteis, and I did some stories with him. So he's a character that I think you could take risks with because he's obscure. You could, that I could do strange things with him. And Chaykin did, with Denny O'Neil, did some really brilliant, odd stuff with the character, up to and including having dialogue lettered, in English, but lettered in lettering that looked like Hebrew and Yiddish.
Ooh, wow. Little Eisnery in there. Yeah. Good answers all around. I'm not surprised. We have an educated group here. So, as some people in the audience may know or may not know, the comic book industry, which is where superhero fiction as we know it sort of crystallized and became what we think of it as today, that industry was very, very Jewish. And I don't just mean that in the way that you do with Lenny Bruce, like that Jewish, that Goyish. No, it really was Jews creating this industry, not solely, but a lot of the people in charge were people who were from Eastern Europe or who had parents who were. And I guess I'm curious, Danny, you've written a wonderful book called Disguised as Clark Kent, about the Jews who helped infuse superheroes into the world through the comic book industry. I guess I'm curious, what do you think the influence of that fact that there were Jews making these comics ended up, broadly speaking, how much of that ended up in the comics and the superheroes that came out of it? And how much of that is us looking for causation that might not actually be there?
I think we're looking for causation that is there, but unconsciously. I think comics was kind of like the garment industry, and actually started out in a lot of the same factory lofts in New York. That in the back they were making schmatas, and in the front they were making comics, or vice versa. Comics was the product of young people, mostly men, some women, who had these artistic and creative skills, and they were born mostly of immigrant parents, and suddenly they're here in America, and they're freer than they would have been in Europe, but they can't get really into advertising or publishing much. But there's this new thing called comic books that is desperate for anybody who can write or draw. And so suddenly you have people like Al Jaffe, like Jack Kirby, people, phenomenal talents who can't get work anywhere else, who have this energy, and who at like age 17, 18, 19 are out earning their fathers, I mean, this is so, and a lot of Italians as well, a lot of Irish people, but definitely many children of Jewish immigrants, some immigrants. So I think the last thing they wanted to do was tell Jewish stories, but I think just because of who they were and their backgrounds and their place in the world, and including the whole secret identity thing, and hiding who you are, and being one thing at home and one thing in the world. I think there's rich Jewish subtext, most of it unintentional, certainly in the early days.
And I guess I'm curious, moving on to Chris, your Jewish upbringing is something that I think a lot of people, even people who consider themselves diehard Chris Claremont fans, don't necessarily know much about. I know when I wrote an article about your path with the character of Magneto, who we'll get into later, and I wrote about, you being Jewish in that, I got a lot of surprise DMs from people and texts going like, he's one of ours. I'm so honored. I had no idea. I guess I'm curious. Can you give us a little bit of a sense of your Jewish background and maybe how some of that played into the work you did in the comics industry?
The blunt answer is, in terms of my quote unquote Jewish background, it's non-existent. No, I mean, it's in terms of ancestry, it derives mostly from my maternal grandfather, who's Russian and Jewish, and he and his brothers skipped out of Russia a few seconds before the Tsar's secret police caught up with them, and basically headed west. I think the aspect I ended up bringing to the X canon was more on the side of being immigrant, and for want of a more accurate description, English, because being English and growing up along the South and Central America, Central United States, was pretty weird. And it wasn't really until coming to New York that a more cosmopolitan reality set in. And even then, because I grew up on Long Island, the towns on Long Island are sort of separated as enclaves. You know, Hicksville is one, Syosset another, Massapequa a third, North Massapequa is one thing, Nassau Shores another. So everything was very compartmentalized, and you know, it's complicated in that my awareness of it, of this in terms of the X canon, comes more from being an immigrant who became more aware of my Jewish ancestry as I went along. And that mostly grew out of time I spent in Israel when I was in university.
Yeah, I was wondering if you might tell us a little bit about that, because I know it had an impact on you.
Well, it's back in those days, the Bard College where I went shut down for 2 months, and from January to March, ostensibly for field period, they called it, which is where students were meant to go out and get jobs relating to their major subjects. We, as the students, figured it was basically to get us out of town while they turned off the heat, because it was a very poor college. And back in those days, there was this reality called winter. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It's when things get really cold and it snows. Yeah. Snow is sort of solid, partially solid.
Okay.
It's a 20th century thing. I'm sorry.
Someday, I know, they'll read about it.
Don't laugh. I mean, it's, you know.
I know.
A Kevin Costner film and realizing, oh my God, he knew what he was talking about. That's terrifying. But I mean, stepping off a plane in Tel Aviv, and then spending 2 months on a kibbutz that was 5 clicks from the Jordan border. And this is 1970. So it's sort of midway between the 68 war and the 73 war.
67, but yes, yeah.
67.
No, it's fine. I just, yeah.
Us old people, you know.
Totally
it
fine.
was, but the weird thing is sitting, you know, we had a Saturday movie night after, you know, because it was a very progressive / liberal kibbutz. And sitting there with survivors of the Shoah watching Judgment at Nuremberg is creepy. But sitting there realizing the people I was sitting with and working with had been there and understood what was happening, and were looking at this from a totally different perspective than I, as a young American, admittedly in the middle of the Vietnam War. But these are realizations that you won't find growing up in the States. It's dealing with the reality, dealing with a sense of history of what was and what is and what we're trying to do in the future. Was unlike anything I had experienced to that date, and to a large extent have experienced since. And that all factored into everything I've been writing for the last umpty bump years.
Yeah, you can't not.
Well, it's rare. The weird thing in a lot of senses about being Jewish in America, then and now, is this sense of still being an outsider, of finding people who will march in the streets and casually say, we don't hate you, but. And that is something I keep trying to reach out to, embrace from a writing perspective, and try in the characters to help the readers understand it. A scene that goes to that point is when she and Eric / Magneto go to a memorial at the Holocaust Museum in Washington and stand up and say the names of relatives in hope that someone in the audience who is also a survivor of the Shoah might know them, or might have heard of them, or might know somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody. And that's something you didn't see happen very often when I was reading it to the Man of Steel or to Reed Richards.
Yeah. Marguerite, I'm curious. You did. I was revisiting your Bombshells work in preparation for this and reading the Jewish stuff. And I'll admit, when you were initially writing Bombshells, you probably knew more about Judaism than I, someone with a bar mitzvah, knew. I recently, since Bombshells began, have gone on this Jewish path. This is not about me, so I'm not going to get into it. But I remember reading Bombshells when it came out and being like, oh, cool, there's a Jewish character. And then later, as Jewish identification became more important for me and sort of Jewish stories became more important, and more importantly, my smell test got better and I could see when people were like not actually up on their stuff. I was like going back to Bombshells, curious to see what happens. And like, you nailed it. Like you really did a terrific job of well, it just doesn't come across as like, here's my book report on the Jews, you know. What a lesser writer and trust me, comics has a lot of lesser writers, could easily have fallen into, but that wasn't it. It felt very lived in. Could you tell me a little bit about your process of kind of where you came from, about what you knew about Jewish civilization and life, and then how you got from that point to the point where you were making these comics that I was just talking about?
While I do not have the honor of being born Jewish, I have had the immense privilege of falling in love with several spectacular Jewish women.
Great.
And so through them, I was introduced to the community and to scripture and to the history and heritage. And that in its own way has been one of the largest love affairs of my life. I've struggled with my faith a number of times, and forgive me if I'm getting, too much into it, but I have come close to converting. And, even though God and I have tabled that for the moment, the conversation isn't over. So don't give up on me yet.
Got it.
But yes, very much like through them, and through, the world they lived in and the community, that they grew up in, that was, really just the start of, I was just so moved and enchanted And you know, even going back, you know, through, you know, the stories and like through the Torah, you know, just over and over, the stories of the women were once again what captivated me. And so that was, you know, their ferocity and their elegance and like their passion and faith over and over again, and the desire to serve and the desire to do good, no matter the cost. Like that was something that just moved me so very much. And you know, the passage, you know, the most romantic parts, you know, people quote from the Book of Ruth, and that is Ruth speaking to another woman, and so that meant, you know, a great deal to me. You know, again, growing up closeted in the South.
That's right. I get, yeah. Whither thou goest, I will go. There it is. Yeah. That's lovely. And then, so you steeped in it in your life through that.
Yeah.
And then you're approaching this character.
Mm-hmm.
What additional research did you do? What were things you were concerned about? Just anything you remember from that, I'd love to hear.
Well, I'm terrifically spoiled in that all of my parents, my mother, my father, my stepmother, and my stepfather were all history teachers at one point or another.
Damn.
And so, yeah, after we ran out of fairy tales and Twilight Zone episodes and Star Trek, we started moving on to scenes from history. And so, you know, I grew up with things from, you know, the Civil War down to the Siege of Masada. And those were, you know, moments, you know, again, with the investigation and, you know, these love of, you know, these girlfriends that I had combined with this love of history. And so I was really drawing from a lot of that for the things that had meant the most to me, you know, to bring to Bombshells. I mean, you know, I'm hoping that it's true for most writers, is that the things that they're most passionate about is ideally what you would like to see translated into their work. But yes, that was, you know, Kate Kane was just this perfect lightning rod for the things that I loved best and feared most.
No kidding. Danny, I want to talk about sort of two phases of your life. I want to talk first about what it was like being Jewish and caring about being Jewish and being from a notable Jewish family, not to put you on the spot, and reading comics growing up. And then I'll get to the second half, which is I want to know sort of once you were actually in the industry, what being Jewish meant to you as you were writing and editing and working there. But first, I'd love to know when you were a young, you know, Jewish rapscallion out there in the hustle, what was it like reading superhero comics? You know, what did they feel Jewish to you?
Well, you know, it's you know, my father was a famous cantor, which is a lot like being a famous comic book writer. No offense. Or maybe more like being a famous comic book editor. You know, to people who it's important to, it's very important. To most people, not so much. So I came from a deep Jewish background, which I was highly conflicted over. But I was in my yeshiva. There were a core group of us who were obsessed with comics, and especially with the Marvel comics when they came out. You know, we were the perfect baby boom age for that stuff to just bore straight into our skulls. You know, there must have been something about, especially Stan, the consciousness, the whole tone that Stan Lee brought to the comic books. You know, that sort of insider, you talk about Lenny Bruce, you know, just sort of a New York Jewish smartass thing that came from a tradition of the Mad Magazine people and Harvey Kurtzman, you know, Bill Gaines, Feldstein, all those people were, you know, what I was talking about before, first generation American born. You know, you and I have both written biographies of Stan, so you know how deep and how conflicted he himself was, and yet you know, one of my favorite Stan stories is he's out walking with an artist named Jim Mooney. They were good friends, and Stan loved to walk, and Stan has a new suit on that he's very proud of. You know, Stan loved to dress nicely, and a pigeon flies over and craps right on Stan. And the way now Jim Mooney tells the story, according to Mooney, Stan looks up at the pigeon, waves his fist and says, "For the Gentiles you sing." I'm guessing he didn't use the word Gentiles. I'm guessing he said, "For the Goyim you sing." But
oh, that's very clever. I hadn't thought to read through that, but you're probably
yeah,
right.
yeah. So well, either way, it's a. So I mean, something felt very at home to me about the comics, and then and looking back at a lot of the DC comics of my childhood too. They're these. I mean, Superman, who for the first 20 years of his life, of existence, never thought about the fact that he was the sole survivor of the planet Krypton. Suddenly, we're in the late 50s, early 60s, post-Holocaust. People are starting to be able to talk about it because it wasn't talked about a lot. It was not, and even the word Holocaust hadn't come into common usage for the murder of the European Jews by the Nazis. I mean, so suddenly there's this consciousness, and Jerry Siegel, who co-created Superman, is now writing these in-depth stories. So there was a swirl that felt very familiar to me. Now, of course, I am born, raised, and live in Manhattan, which makes me the most provincial person you'll ever meet. So so my view of things was a very Jewish view, but it felt at home. And like I said, there were maybe 3 or 4 of us in my class in this fancy schmancy Upper East Side yeshiva that were super into comics, and and we lived and breathed, and there must have been something familiar about it. And I look back on it now, and I can see it's there. I realized that it's a guy named Will Eisner, who was one of the giants of the industry and of the medium and of the genre, who helped invent comics and helped invent what we think of as the graphic novel with Jewish content, both as subtext and as main text. And I was intrigued by him when I read Jules Feiffer's The Great Comic Book Heroes, which was the Hanukkah gift of 1965. I mean, there was no other gift. I don't know about you, Chris, but there was no other gift I wanted for the holidays in '65. And Pfeiffer, I think, started to put it together, what it was about, the Jewish backgrounds of these guys, and I mean, that book still holds up, I think. So I don't even know have I even come anywhere close to answering your question, because I don't even know how I got here. You're muted.
If I may, Danny.
Yeah.
Oops, I was muted, but that gives Chris an opportunity. Go ahead. Yes.
No, 1965. My Christmas gift was a Man from Uncle playset.
Oh, well, that's pretty good. That's pretty good too.
Of our differentiation.
Chris, well, I want to come back to Danny in a moment, but that was a good answer, and I want to also. It makes me think. I would love, Chris, if you wouldn't mind giving a little bit of an abridged version of your story with Magneto, a character who means a lot to a lot of people. I know all of you, and I'm sure everyone at home has been watching very closely my book tour this past year. It's been the hottest news at the top of CNN. But I talk a lot about Magneto when people ask me about, stories. Occasionally people will be like, hey, if you ever got to write for Marvel, what would you write? Which is like not the best question, because that's not happening. So I always give the answer that is true, and that they would never allow me to do, which is I want to tell the most Jewish Magneto story that's ever been told, a story so Jewish that the ADL will call it anti-Semitic. Like, I want it to be so authentically and deeply rooted in these ideas that you were so wise to start bringing out. And I'm curious, could you give me give for people who don't really know how that went down? Could you give a little sense of that?
You're wanting to write Magneto?
No, no, I can't. I couldn't do it because you've already perfected the form. But
No, I mean, Magneto started out as the X-Men's equivalent of Doctor Doom and Green Goblin. Every series, every character has a primal adversary. Superman has Lex Luthor.
Yeah, he's got a few, probably Lex, you'd say, yeah.
But with Magneto, for the first 48 odd issues, he was portrayed as a traditional comic book villain. He ranted, he raged, he did stuff. He was generic. So in the late 60s, very early 70s, he ran into an alien super being who turned him back into a baby, and was dumped on Charles Xavier's doorstep and said, here's your problem now. So Charlie, being, conscientious, handed him off to Moira McTaggart and forgot about him. Then when Dave Cockrum and I came back onto the series after Len Wein, who co-created the reboot of the X-Men with Dave, we needed our mega adversary, which is obviously Magneto, which meant we had to find a way to bring him back up to speed, make him an adult again, but at the same time, from my perspective, make him interesting, because who cares about a mad, demagogue? Every series has one. They're all the same. They're basically boring, which meant sitting down and figuring out who the character is. Where did he come from? What elements make him do what he did? And since we're talking 1975, the answer is obvious. He's a man like Charlie in his very late 40s, early 50s. Okay, scale that back. Where does that put him? That puts him born in the 20s, 30s, which means he came of age in Europe,
There you go.
in the war. And that leads to a fairly obvious next step. What would make him so crazy? The Shoah. And from then it was just a natural cascade. I mean, the thing about being a mutant in the Marvel pantheon, especially in the Comics Code era, when you couldn't say things specifically about certain social issues, you had to find an analog for it.
Right.
And being mutant is the most obvious. It fit everything. It fit being gay, it fit being black, it fit being Jewish, it fit being Muslim. It was from a storytelling perspective, it is the best foundation for creating character and conflict in comic books, because it is relatively unique and it applies to everyone if it's done right. And with Magneto, it was, if you're going to bring him back as the major adversary, you do everything you can to have him be the major adversary, which is why the first 2 or 3 times he and the X-Men encountered one another, he beat the living daylights out of them. And they only survived by a miracle in each case. But then why does he do the things he does? And the Shoah was it. And once I went back to that and started adding to my own knowledge as a political theorist of what those events and those people and those circumstances were, it just, everything grew naturally. The frustration from my aspect of it was that my ultimate goal back in the very late 80s and 1990 was, I wanted him to evolve into a hero. I wanted him to take over the school. I wanted to get Charlie out of the way, simply because with Charlie, he's already perfect. All you can do is diminish him. He is everything you want in an ideal teacher, a master of, the Doctor Strange of the mutant world. There are no flaws other than the fact that he's paralyzed, and once he had his interstellar girlfriend, you could get rid of that, which we tried to instantly. Magneto, because of all the conflicts within him, to me worked so much better as a conflicted hero, as someone who could walk up to the edge and desperately want to step over that edge because he knows it'll save the day. And yet the New Mutants, his students, are always trying desperately to pull him back because they know if he goes over that step, he'll take the next step and the next and the next, and they'll bring him with him. And to me, that exemplified in fiction the reality I knew from history of looking at the conflict between Menachem Begin and David Ben-Gurion.
Mm-hmm.
On one hand, you had, I am the father of the Jewish state. On the other hand, I'm the pissant pain in the ass who loved blowing up the English. We'll leave that part out of it. And ultimately, though, it was Begin who forged the peace accord with Anwar Sadat,
Mm-hmm.
and won himself the Nobel Peace Prize. Who'd have thought? You could make bets on that. No one would have taken it. The thing is that reality interacts with character, with people in remarkable ways. And the presumptions one makes about a person, a leader, can be upended by that leader growing that extra step necessary to do the right thing for his country in the world situation. And that was what I wanted to do with Magneto, because to me, if he's always the adversary, he's always going to lose, because that's the nature of dramatic storytelling. But if you try to make the reader understand him and root for him and see where he wants to go with his life, if he's hopefully on the side of the angels, if he has something to lose, then you have ongoing and increasing tension between the character and the audience, because you never know what the writer will come up with. You know, they used to say, no one will kill a superhero until Jean Grey. And if you can cross that threshold and get away with it, you can do anything. And with Magneto, it was a way of expressing opinions. It was a way of making points. It was a way, I hoped, of keeping the audience interested and on the edge of their seats. But Marvel had other ideas.
Well,
No, it's
no, I know. It's no small thing. It's no small thing.
It's a much easier way to get Ian McKellen up there and being the monster, rather than having Ian McKellen stand up there and be something more empathetic, which, you know, it's one person's King Lear versus another person's, you know, whatever. Well
said. No, but that's it. We're running out of time a little bit. I want to get to some of the. No, what are you apologizing for? You're great. This was great. No, please. I would have stopped you if I thought it wasn't interesting. I want to get to some of the Q&A questions. And one thing that I think was interesting here that kind of is not exactly specifically Jewish, but I think you can see pretty clearly that you can make it Jewish, which is, you know, what's the purpose of telling a superhero story? Like, why is this a genre that, let's say, if we're trying to talk about issues like what Chris is talking about, you know, exclusion and difference, issues that matter to people who care about Jewish topics. And you're talking about all this. Why do we keep coming back to superheroes? You know, to talk about these questions of marginalization and powerlessness and finding power and identification. You know, I'm curious. I want to start with Marguerite. Is there? Why do you think we keep coming back to these stories in this way?
I think it's the story of the magnificent other. of having to, like we were discussing earlier, of having that secret identity of being constantly judged or marginalized or overlooked in your day-to-day life, and no one knows what you could be. No one knows what you are, when you're given the chance. So,
Danny, Chris, do you have thoughts on why we keep coming to the well for these kinds of stories, and why outsiders often so identify with superheroes?
They look really cute in skin-tight costumes.
They do,
That's true.
and they're cool, and it's fun, even at their most, hand stapled to their brow. It's fun to be them because they can do this cool stuff. But they've become an all-purpose metaphor. I mean, it's funny how in TV and movies, the way it did in comics, for better or worse, the superhero took over all the other genres. There are superhero soap operas and superhero science fiction and superhero cowboy, somehow people,
and rivals making comments about the superhero movie is taking over everything.
There's something
That's funny to think about. No, we're good.
There's something about that fantasy of having, if only they knew, that I could unleash this destructive power, but I don't, because I'm really a good person. That's why I'm the hero, not the villain.
See, I go slightly differently. The thing that is so wonderful about Peter Parker is he's the amazing Spider-Man. He can do all this stuff, but he still has to pass a test. He still has to find a way to pay the rent. He still has problems with his girlfriend, or that he doesn't have a girlfriend at all. That's, for me, is reading this stuff when I was a kid. This never happened to Clark Kent. It sure, Bruce Wayne had his own living kid.
Well, the Marvel, Stan and Jack and Steve came up with that. They call it heroes of feet of clay, but it's the heroes who are, as you said, Chris, who they're having their powers doesn't solve their problems. It just gives them problems.
Many respects, it makes them worse.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, that gets, not to put on my amateur rabbi hat, but one of these days I want to be able to deliver a rabbinic sermon about my big theory about Spider-Man, which is what makes the original Ditko Lee run on Spidey so compelling to me, in a way that even amazing, well, I shouldn't just use that word. I guess that means nothing in Spider-Man. Every amazing Spider-Man story is amazing. But even the best Spider-Man stories, there's a particular thing about that initial run that really amazes me. I gotta stop saying that word, which is, in a lot of depictions of Spider-Man that shall remain nameless because I don't want to toss anybody down. Basically, Spidey realizes that the robber was the one who killed Uncle Ben, and then a light switch flips. With great power, there must also come great responsibility. And from then on out, he's a good guy. He learned his lesson. What I love about the original run is Stan and Steve really have him in this almost religious, this very Jewish, even if it's not necessarily supposed to be that, struggle where it's the world really sucks for Peter. As you say, Chris, he has to do the test. His aunt is sick. He's grieving for his dead uncle. His parents aren't anywhere to be found. He has this really rough life, and he has to constantly fight the urge to give in to the kind of greed that allowed Uncle Ben to die. It's never as interesting to me when you have a Spider-Man where he's just sort of happy-go-lucky by disposition, just kind of a happy guy. It's much more interesting if he's somebody who, like any number of Jewish figures that you can find in scripture or you can find in great Jewish literature, who really wrestle with guilt and temptation and redemption. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, I don't even really know where I was going with that, but that's something that's been on my mind lately, thinking about kind of the Jewish struggle aspects of those early Spider-Man issues. Danny, do you have thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah, you might you would think I might, Oh,
I'm sure you're smarter about this than I am. This is just my pet theory, but
look, Marvel discovered that there was entertainment in depressed, neurotic characters. the Thing, the Hulk, Spider-Man, the one redeeming thing they have is, holy cow, I got this webbing and I can swing across the city. No matter how crappy my life gets, thwip, I'm fucking Spider-Man. So
Yeah, that really works for Bruce Banner.
well,
yeah.
Bruce doesn't have that much fun. It's true. There is a limit. but even Bruce gets to go, I'm the smartest guy in the room, right? At least he gets to have that satisfaction.
That's fair. Anyway, go ahead. So, okay, let's see here. I'm going to look at some of the other. Oh, yeah, Marguerite, were you raising your hand or you were?
No, sorry, I'm just adjusting my glasses for.
No. I feel bad. I don't want to like pigeonhole you here because are there other thoughts about stuff we've been discussing that I haven't been addressing?
I'm happy to do the Q&A.
Okay, great. Let's just keep going to the Q&A. Terrific. A question specifically for Chris. How do you feel about oh no, you know what? I don't want to get into the old grievances. I feel like if we start turning this into how do you feel about how the characters that you so loved and put such care into have been treated later, I feel like we're going to get into an awkward place. So
I don't know. I don't read them.
Okay, well,
that is so healthy.
that is.
He so loved the character that never mind. That's another. Okay.
Isn't it true that comic books by Jewish writers who came to be since newspapers would not publish them because of anti-Semitism? I'm not familiar with that theory. Maybe I'm misunderstanding what it's saying. Danny, do you have any insight on that?
Well, I mean, it was kind of a closed club. While there were, Jewish syndicated cartoonists, by and large, it was a closed shop, and so if you had those kind of skills, then the comic books would be where you would go, which was a much more volume business, and a lot of these companies were owned by Jews and often relatives of the artists. So it was, there was, there's this. So if you could hold a pencil or work a typewriter even with one finger, you could likely write these stories, but there was, my understanding, talking to the old timers, is that getting into syndication was a very closed, restricted kind of world. They occasionally get Al Cap, or somebody like that in, but the comics were much easier to get into, and the skill set needed to draw comics in the 30s and 40s. The bar was much lower. The skills you had to have.
Well,
Marguerite. Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead. What is it, Chris?
Just a simple reality of doing a 20-page comic every month. And unless you were Jack, in which case you did a 20-page, or John Buscema, in which case you did it every day.
Yeah.
But no, you needed to generate money, and the only way you could generate money was by producing material. And the one thing about Marvel and DC and was that they had material. They needed material. And
I do recommend a lot of, not just because I work as a consultant with the Will Eisner Studio, but I do recommend Eisner's. Everybody knows Contract with God. If they don't, they should. But I recommend To the Heart of the Storm, and also something called The Dreamer. That's really about Eisner's experience in and description of that early world of comics and the realities. There's a chilling scene where Eisner has been very successful in comics, in the early golden age, so-called, and then he's being recruited to do this thing called The Spirit, which is a comic book insert that appeared in newspapers, because the newspapers syndicates wanted to compete with the comic book phenomenon. And Eisner is out with his liaison at the syndicate, and the guy just goes into a rant about how the Jews are horrible and they're dragging us into war and they're greedy and evil, and then it's suddenly like, oh, and Will, why don't you come over? My wife and I would love to have you over for dinner. It's like that duality. This guy, not that Eisner had to, that everybody lived, that was the world, I mean, Chris alluded to that even in more modern times,
When he said, "Have you over for dinner?" was that as a guest or as the main course?
Hi-yo.
You'll have to read the book to find out.
I don't exactly know how the question answer module goes. There were questions here and now they've all disappeared for some reason, but that's fine because I wanted to ask sort of a concluding question.
I'll go check the chat. Just this is Sydney jumping in. You can check the chat as well.
Oh, okay, great. Well, I wanted to ask one question and maybe this will conclude it. We'll see if everybody has answers that can fill out the time. But Marguerite, you mentioned your familiarity with scripture, and I'm curious for everybody, is there a Jewish story or character outside of the traditional superhero canon that has particularly moved you and maybe even influenced the way you do write superhero stories? Is there like a Jewish character, be it from scripture, a Cynthia Ozick novel, whatever you like, something that seems to have a character or a story that's wormed its way into your brain like that?
Wow.
Someone else go first while I ponder. This is very difficult.
Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to spring this on you. I should have prepped everybody. It's a deep.
I got a list of questions. That's not on this list.
It just occurred to me. What can I do?
Wow. Is there a?
I can move on to another one if this is going to be one of those turf out.
It's just,
Favorite book of scripture? How about that? I'll go first. I'm a big Job guy. Anybody else here into the book of Job?
Job is it's kind of Spider-Man-like, It
is a lot of superhero stories you can read the book of Job in there.
Yeah, I think Job. I think Disney owns Job now, don't they? I think.
Job Origins. We'll find out about what was going on in the land of Uz before Hashem decided to make a bet with Satan. Yeah, I can't wait. Go ahead.
I mean, mine, it just becomes a giant tiebreaker. And once again, the stories of the women, I love Judith slaying Holofernes. I love Jael and the tent pole. Like, I'm torn. I'm stuck.
I recently got a t-shirt that is no until 2000 AD that I bought it because it's completely illegal, but somebody made a Judge Dredd style design, except it says Judge Deb, and it's Deborah from Devorah from the Bible. And instead of he is the law, it just says she upholds the law.
Yes. And
it's from this like very earnest Jewish t-shirt making company. Like, this was not some comics person trying to do a riff. They were like, this was like a cool youth pastor thing for Jews, but I was like, also, this is amazing. The art was very good. Anyway, but that's a good answer.
I think what there must be a reason for me personally that, right, the Jewish American novelists of the 50s, 60s, right, there's somewhere, even though I once asked Stan directly and he denied it, but somewhere he or Kirby, maybe Larry Lieber, I think they were reading Saul Bellow and Bernard Malamud and Philip Roth. Somewhere I think that somewhere I think that snuck in and informed the Marvel characters.
Or at least they're drawing from a common well. It may not be that the connection was sideways, but rather they weren't reading each other, but they were all coming from
living the same time.
But then, if I may, it's not simply that they're reading from source material, that brilliant though it is, it's within the texture of the Depression, the war, but in the war, the Holocaust. I mean, to have gone through that, even regardless of whether or not you were actually in Europe with the army or whatever, or assigned stateside and looking at it from a distance, you can't help but have the impact to make a resonance. And then post-war, especially if you're a New York-centric creator, to have to deal with the very inescapable racism that existed in some of the surrounding states. none of this was abstract. It was all real. It was all in everyone's face. But finally, there was perhaps a sense, a necessity, and with comics, a means of giving voice to the feelings, the conflicts, maybe finding a way to try to resolve it, that carried through to us when we got to the Vietnam era.
Yeah. Lot to dig in there. I think this is a good place to stop. If we keep going, we're going to go well over time. But this has been really lovely. Does anybody have any final thoughts among the three of y'all? Anything you wish we'd gotten to? Any closing benedictions?
If anyone in the chat has any more questions, I'm happy to, answer them after an email if, it's good.
Yeah, there were some that were a little specific, and I felt like, these are folks who contact the organizers or something. I'm sure we can get notes around.
Yeah.
But
Right. Yeah. Same thing. I'm findable,
I'm very findable as well. So you got.
Well, if you happen to be on the west side of New York next Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, there is this gathering.
New York Comic-Con, it's back, baby.
Well, that's the theory anyway. It's
Right.
8 days away. Anything could happen.
Anything could happen. That's
Oh,
very
wait, no, 5 days away. Oh, dear.
Mhm. Well, anyway, well, thank you to all the panelists. I really appreciate this. This was a really lovely conversation, and thank you, Sydney.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all so much. This has been really great. I learned so much. So I really appreciate you all being here. And Abraham, thank you so much. Your questions are so great. And I just learned so much. To all of you watching, everything we do at the museum is made possible through donor support. So we hope that you will consider making a donation to support the museum or becoming a member. And also, of course, joining us for our upcoming programs, which you can check out at the link in the Zoom chat. So have a great evening. And thank you all again for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting.
Everybody. Take care, everybody.